True Tales of the Rails. Actual happenings as told by eyewitnesses. Railroad Magazine, 1957. Boomers and Their Women by Haywire Mac. Many boomers, drifting from one streak of rust to another in the old days, liked to regard themselves as Casanovas. Of course, we could travel faster by rail than Casanova did by stagecoach, and in between romantic episodes, we did our share of railroad work. Not long after I hit the boomer trail, I landed in Cleveland and took a job as a yard brakeman on the Pincy, the old Cleveland and Pittsburgh. It was springtime, the big lake freighters were starting to pour their cargoes of iron ore into the waiting cars, and railroaders were in demand. Dozens were hired daily, and there seemed to be a very lenient attitude in the matter of checking previous employment records as set down on the application form. My first assignment was a rider on the Kinsman Street hump. This was a new method of switching cars. The same method is in general used today, but now has a modern mechanical aid. There were no retarders. Cars were controlled by riders wielding a pick handle for extra leverage on the handbrakes, and the switches were flipped by a flock of agile youngsters. With a bunch of smart boomers among the riders, it was possible for a few men to hide out at time and take a snooze in some empty boxcar, or maybe wander off with the girl for a couple hours at a stretch. The conductor didn't squawk as long as the job kept moving. We railroaders work a 12-hour shift, whether night or day, and only by playing hooky for a short spell could we enjoy feminine companionship. Except, of course, when we'd take a night off to play the Casanova role in a big way. Rafferty's Saloon on Ontario Street, Cleveland was a likely spot for picking up dames. In addition to a barroom on the main floor, it had a discreet side entrance to hell, as the preachers called it. A dimly lit stairway led to a large second-story room. There, even in the afternoons, you can find a scattering of men and often several women. There were no bright lights. Liquor was sold, and the management supplied free entertainment with 1 and 2 real silent movies, plus a teeny piano and occasionally a singer warbling sentimental ditties. In an emergency, a message from the yard office would be flashed on the screen asking for so-and-so to report for work at once in a freight crew. Women were not served at the bars in that era. Rafferty's was about the only gin mill in downtown Cleveland where a gal could pop in for a quick one, or dawdle and fan the breeze with railroad men. Some of the ladies were snooty about forming casual acquaintanceships, but others had ways of letting you know their charms were at the disposal of anyone with even a modest bankroll. When I was a young fellow and jobs were scarce in the States, many a rail would drift into Mexico. I did so myself. I remember a handsome young fireman there, Bert Hull, who was promoted to the right-handed side and given a passenger run between August and Jimicle. Bert had a way with women. He tipped off the Pullman porter on his train to contact pretty girls who were riding the cushions and invite them into the engine cab, and it was not unusual to see him wheeling the varnish at 50 or 60 per with a dame or two at his elbow. Love 'em and leave 'em was the slogan of many a boomer. Which reminds me of an experience that my friend Maxwell Swan had with a fellow drifter who he identified only as the Kid. It seems that the Kid was the best car hand Max had ever worked with, a master of hand signals. He was also good looking, maybe too good looking, but there his virtues ended. He sported a big white Stinson and otherwise dressed sharply. The story, as I remember it: one day our train rolled eastward out of Salem, Washington, on the St. Paul Road, and we stopped at Ellensburg to put in the feed bag. For some reason, maybe a hunch, the Kid didn't go into the Greasy Spoon with the rest of us but hung around the caboose. I slid into a seat and studied the menu. Presently the waitress came up. She was small but well developed, with all the curves in the right places and pretty red hair and a face to match. While she was taking my order, she asked if I worked on that train, and when I said yes, she asked if I knew the Kid, mentioning his name. Sure, I told her. He's in our crew. The gal said calmly, I'm his wife. The news almost bowled me over. Why the devil any man in his right mind would deliberately pass up on a choice specimen like her was more than I could have figured out. The Kid must have bats in his belfry. We sat there a few minutes and talked, the rest of the crew finishing stuffing their bellies, and walked out, leaving us two alone. I knew that our train was on the short time for the next meet. Soon I heard the engine whistle off, and she was a Skentney 10-wheeler, and that meant the kid had opened the gate. I had to hustle. The waitress removed her apron to follow me, but she was too late. When I reached the switch, the kid was not in sight, and so I stayed there to close it. The gal asked breathlessly, "Where is he?" Up ahead, I pointed. The train was already pulling out, her brown eyes rimmed with tears, but I was too busy to notice her very much. Throwing the switch behind the caboose wheels, I sprinted after the train, caught it, and swung a highball. Then I looked back. A forlorn little figure was still standing beside the switch. Inside the crummy, I found the kid sitting on the cushions, and I said, "Just saw your wife." His answer was quick and sharp. "You didn't tell her where I was, did you?" "Why, sure I did," I said. His tone nettled me. I resented the fact that Brown Eyes was throwing herself away on a heel. "You never told me your private affairs," I added. "I thought you'd be glad to meet her." The kid glared at me. "Glad hell! That little bitch has been trailing me from Jerusalem to Jericho. Can't shake her. No sooner do I get a new job than she bobs up again. I'm just fed up on her." His mood was sour, so I dropped the subject, but as I climbed into the cupola to watch the scenery drift by, I could not help wondering how many a guy would give everything he owned to be in the kid's shoes that day and be followed by a neat dish breaking her heart over him. Well, that was Max's story as near as I can recall it. Why are some skirts like that? Treat 'em rotten and they're still crazy about you. There were plenty fine and decent women along the Boomer Trail. Girls like Brown Eyes had a lot of other waitresses I met, especially those in the Harvey's house in Santa Fe. That kind had nothing to sell but the food they brought you on a tray, and you'd better not have tried making a pass at any one of them. But there were exceptions. A book written by a former railroad yardman named Herbert Ashbury offers this bit of Americana. Many small communities were not able to support even a part-time harlot. Consequently, some members of the craft went from town to town. I recall one who made several towns along the OK Railroad, name disguised, in northeastern Missouri as regularly as shoe drummers. Her shooter was always an empty boxcar on the town siding, and she had a mania for inscribing in such cars the exact hours and dates of her adventures and her honor area. It was not unusual to find in a car some inscription as this: 10 p.m., July 8th, 50 cents. These writings, scrawled in lead pencil or with a bit of chalk, were signed Boxcar Molly. Once, in a car from which I had unloaded many heavy bags of cement, I came across what seemed to be a choice bit of very early and apparently authentic Boxcar Mollyana. On the wall was this: "I was ruined and this car made 10. Boxcar Molly." Maybe it's unfair to me to bring it up after all these years, but at least a few boomers must have fading memories of collecting fare of a sort from female hobos who made a point of riding freights. As a rule, the boxcar berthers were not attractive. Maybe that's why they took to the rails. One of them wrote her life story unsigned in a book called Sister of the Road. The copy I read was appropriately bound in scarlet. Those unwashed boxcar berthers belonged to a long ago boomer era. You don't find any of them riding freights today. Callboys, too, have vanished. I mean the type who pedaled his bike through town carrying a little black book for you to sign. His job was to summon men for engine and train crews, no matter where he had to go to find them, and he almost never failed. The way a cowboy got around, says Bill Nape, a close friend of mine, who was once a boomer trainman, wised him to situations that would have been dynamite if he had talked too much. He could have disrupted the social and gamely life of a fair proportion of the terminal's population, but he kept a discreet silence. In a certain quiet street just off the main business center, or in a shabby district across the tracks, where dim red lights shone through transom and drapery, he knew whether to visit Ruby or Gladys or Blanche's in order to contact the railroad man he was looking for. A one-time rover known as Bob the King Snipe, who is now home guarding in Michigan with his wife and one of the prettiest daughters you'd ever want to brag about, has this to say on the subject of free-willin' women. "I have ditched a lot of girlfriends in my day, and been drained and ditched by others. The score is even. While I was tamping ties for the Long Island, my flame was a red-hot number named Dorothy. She and I might have become a permanent team, but when I was away from town on an Erie Railroad job, Dorothy got mixed up with some other guy and had to marry him. Wonder where she is today." Back along the old trolley line running between Jamaica and Far Rockaway, in the golden days of youth, a Miss Hooper caught my fancy. The next one I remember was the Jones girl, who gave me the gate for the Wabash firemen with a gift a gad better than mine. But by that time I was wise. A cute-looking piano teacher came along down on the Texas and Pacific. This attachment lasted until she hit a note off key, whereupon I beat it. I've had my share of fun and troubles with women, but I never showed interest in one whom I knew belonged to somebody else. Up in Rockland, Maine, I traveled with a broad until I found she was a sailor's wife, whereupon I left her and the Maine Central too. I will never forget Hazel out of Chicago on the Milwaukee Road. Hazel was an armful of sweetness with more emotion than a manifest freight, but within a short time it was just a case of "Hello, sucker. It's been nice knowing you." The boomer used a lingo of his own in discussing personal matters. His method of addressing the opposite sex was termed greasing the pig. One of the worthy brothers, Click Funkhauser, gives an almost photographic report of a pied-eyed boomer shooting his mouth off to a sympathetic waitress whose crowning glory is peroxided with gilded hair wash. This is how he puts it. I was born with a lantern in both hands and cut my eye teeth on a switch key. I've staggered further backwards drunk than these punk home guards have been away from home. He pounds bang bang on the table, which is located on the back room of Joe's place. Then he interrupts the flow of his blowing up valedictoria by inviting the hash slinger. "Well, I have, Blondie." A moment later he is at it again. "Listen, baby, I was just cut off behind that lousy, stinking, rotten job. I ain't labor no more. I'm capital now. By the dying old Christopher, I came here looking for work. I can leave like I come. The filthy sons of bees can't do that to me. I told 'em how the duck ate the butter without getting any grease on its chin. I told 'em, 'You tell 'em, big boy,' while I pat my feet," Blondie soothes, coming up closer. "Give 'em hell. I'm so mad I can't," she further cajoles the indignant boomer. "Sure, he sure is raving. They stopped his pay and so he up and quit. An hour or so later he is sobbing pitifully in his beer, telling Blondie, unless he blows up in Pittsburgh then it's Blackie, the sad story of his life. Listen, girlie." Girlie listens. Her sympathy is as inexhaustible as the boomer's bankroll. Like the rest of us, Cliff witnessed and overheard the telling of many of a life story in hash houses and pool rooms and gin mills at junction towns from Winnipeg to Juarez and points west. The recital, according to Cliff, usually fell into one of three standard patterns. The favorite theme was the vindictive official back home who blacklisted our hero and got him turned on his reference wherever he went. Another variation, the boomer tired of being hounded, went home and shot the relentless official. We have heard this tale with the brass hat being shot in just about every division point of North America. Diligent search of statistics, however, fails to reveal any such official slaughter. The second and more heart-rending pattern, Cliff goes on, was that of the little wife who ran off with some low-down scum of a fireman, or, if the teller was a fireman, she ran off with some low-down scum of a brakeman. As a rule, the third version was told after the third drink. This tale of love frustration, a broken heart born in silent suffering, was revealed only in confidence to his friends, who were legion at blowing up sprees. The girl he had cherished more than life itself went and married a lecherous old passenger conductor or engineer, spurning the love of an honest young ashcat. The mouthings of wandering rails under the influence of red-eyed would make an interesting chapter in social history. One of the fraternity brothers, Frog Smith, a conductor now basking on a little pike down south, offers this contribution to the subject of boomers and their lady friends. "Harry was the best flagman I ever had, as well as one of the best at re-railing a car with piled-up pine slabs. His only failing was women. Our spot was the Atlantic coastline spur beneath the dirt road that leads into Slater, Florida. When we were not making a move or getting wood like he liked to spend his time sitting on the pilot making passes at women. Later on, that proved to be his undoing. The last I heard of Harry, he was running wide open and headed out of town. Close behind him thudded an irate husband pulling the throttle of a 6-gun. Frog Smith chuckles as he recalls Casanova's hasty exit. Also, on the lighter side, we'll get back to Maxwell Swan. Max tells how old Lady Destiny was making it tough for him. He had shoved a string of cars on a bad order track and learned with horror that he was dragging someone along under the cars, someone whose agonized shouts halted Max in a hurry. When the wheel stopped turning, out crawled a man, all scratched up and mad as a hornet. Max didn't mind that too much because the fellow wasn't really injured, and the trouble had been his own fault. Fact is, he was a car toad making repairs on a brake bean, and he had forgotten to put his blue flag out. Besides, who would think of looking under the cars for a dope that couldn't hear the engine clanking along? So when the fellow recovered his breath after cussing everything connected with the railroad, Max got set to break loose with a tirade of his own. At that moment, a female catamount roared out with the nearby bunk car. She proved to be the victim's wife, a big, husky, battle-axe of woman, and she gave Max a tongue lashing that hurts the hogger's ears to this day. He tried to explain that her husband should have had a blue flag out, that otherwise no car whacker worthy of name would ever get under a car. She replied that any goddamn fool would know men were working on the cars there. The latter remark was unfair. Max had to be familiar with about 300 miles of tunnels, switches, bridges, sidetracks, and grades, and how in the hell could he be expected to ride herd on a half-witted car tank? But the big-bellied Amazon got so abusive that Max hightailed it out for the engine, with her at his heels, and he cut off and galloped out of town without the pickup cars. "We can go back there later and get 'em, Jack," he told the conductor, "but not right now." Which reminds me of the story of that retired boomer engineer known as Turkey Moore. Tells about a temporary window in whose place at Tucson he rented a room back in the days when he was young and sassy. I use that word, he says, because her husband was temporarily a guest of the state for horse stealing. This lady had two pet aversions. One was to be called old, the other had to do with comments on the size of her feet. She was not more than 50, and while I had seen pedal extremities larger than hers, I do not remember when. She went heavy on makeup, perfume, and flashy clothes, evidently considered herself quite a belle. One night, Turkey saw a brakeman named Sitzer, all dolled up in the celluloid collar, a cutaway coat, a fancy vest, and a derby, and asked where he was going. Sitzer refused to say. An hour later, he strode along Main Street with the widow at his arm. Turkey bowed as they passed. Next morning, the boomer met his landlady in the hall and said cheerfully, "I saw you stepping out last night." She tossed her head. "How did you like your new boyfriend?" Still no reply. "Did he treat you right?" Finally she said, "Why, the nasty man insulted me." Turkey sympathized. "He should be ashamed of insulting a nice old lady like you." The torrent of words that ensued caused Turkey Moore to leave in search of another rooming house. At some time in my life I had been a patron of just about every Harvey house on the Santa Fe system, so it was only natural that I should get acquainted with some of their biscuit trundlers. No tale of romance on the rails would be complete without the lowdown on those girls. As you know, the Santa Fe traverses some dreary desert country between Chicago and the West Coast. To feed the road's passengers and employees, the Fred Harvey Company built a string of hotels and eating houses along the line. East of Kansas City, the train carried diners, but west of there they stopped at mealtimes to permit the passengers to eat. When I was breaking on passenger, I would go through the train bawling, for example, "Hutchison, Hutchison, 45 minutes for supper at the Harvey House." The Harvey system was a cupid of the rails. Whilst the Santa Fe Employment Agency in Kansas City was shipping railroad men of every calling from ashcats to oilers, the Harvey Employment Service in Chicago was hiring thousands of girls and sending them to West to be waitresses. And don't get the idea these waitresses were tramps from the city streets. They were fine, wholesome young women, many of them well educated. They made the bleak division points livable. They helped to tame the boomers. Many of them married boomers and supplied an incentive for them to stick on the job and grow whiskers. At some division points, the Harvey girls gave dances. And did the rare-failing men flock to them? Those ladies taught me all I knew about dancing, and plenty of other rails can say the same. Legend has it that at least 20,000 Harvey girls from good homes in the East and Midwest became the brides of railroad men, ranchers, and cowboys, founding many first families in the West. Says Cliff Funkhauser, "Take off your hats to these hashslingers. They civilized the West as no other factor did." You appreciated the clean and sweet Harvey girls even more by contrast with meal dispensers of a more primitive type. For example, down in Punta, Mexico, at the foot of the Zacatecas Mountains, where some of us boomers in train or engine service had to buy a grub, A native crone kept a dove hunt near the track. For hours at a time, recalls Turkey Moore, she squatted on the dirt floor patting out tortillas, a kind of cornbread, while naked brown children would try to snitch food, and the family soul with a brood of piglets was internally rooting around indoors and out in search of something to eat. The meal consisted of tortillas, a dish of friolas, which are beans, and black coffee. There were no tables or chairs. You stood or squatted while you ate. Now and then the old woman would slap a dirty kid or a pig and go right on patting tortillas without stopping to wash her hands. Listen to Jack Wynn, who is rusticating in Kentucky. Back in the boomer era, he calls, every big road had his own system of eating places, but Harvey had the classiest bunch of gals you'd ever want to see behind a hash counter. Many would work up and down the Santa Fe from Fred Harvey's shipping point and back again, especially after they had met a traveling brother. Each girl had two things in mind, a job and a husband. I remember wandering through Texas with a fellow who went by the name Mark Trail. Of course, this was only his flag. Like a lot of us, Mark had lost out on the yardmaster's strike in 1920. The roads had all of us blackballed on our references, so we changed our names. Any moniker was good enough for 29 days. That was the limit you could stay on the railroad job while your phony service letters were being investigated. But when a rush was on and a road was hungry for the men, the brass hats usually waived the requirements of service letters. At Amarillo, we headed for the Harvey house. On our first visit, we couldn't help notice the pretty thing who came up to get our food for us. After her long ride from Kansas City, we were hungry, but this gal had us both in dreams. Her name was Marge. Right away I could see it was a Mark she had her eyes on. Their glances and remarks might easily develop into a first-class love affair. Well, my hunch was right. But as time cut into our 29-day limit, I got the feeling that both of us would be fired out of Amarillo and the romance would wither like a morning glory vine in midday sun. Mark must have feared the same thing, for he talked it over with Marge and she agreed that if he had to leave Amarillo, she would go with him. Inevitably came the day when the Santa Fe tied a can to our tails, but the company had a rule that if it had shipped a man into a town and discharged him, it would ship him out again. So we asked for passes to Clovis, New Mexico. At the same time, Marge told her boss that she had a sister living in Clovis and could she be transferred there. Sure she could. So the three of us boarded a train to Clovis. On our arrival, Marge went to work for the local Harvey house while Mark and I got rip track jobs on the Santa Fe. 10 days later, the loving couple gave each other wedding rings. Mark said that if his references held, he would live there permanently. I drifted on, but 2 years later I returned to Clovis for a visit. Mark and his wife were still there. Marge no longer was a beanery queen and he had risen to the night yard master. She was pregnant. And that, my friends, just about wraps it up. I am a married man myself, very much so, with a long-time good wife and a daughter and 3 grandchildren. But I can't help adding that I met a hell of a lot of women of all types along the Boomer Trail.